They said I peaked in high school. That everything after was just a slow decline into mediocrity. They stopped celebrating my wins and started cataloging my losses. But the truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it, usually through the voice of someone who doesn't know they're about to change everything. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family, if you've ever built something beautiful in the shadows while everyone else looked the other way, then you know why this story matters. Subscribe to the channel because sometimes the most profound revelations come from the people who know you least. My name is Sarah Chin. I'm 29 years old and I live in a converted loft in downtown Portland, Oregon. The kind of place where you can hear the rain on the metal roof and see the city lights blur through industrial windows. I make pour-over coffee every morning using beans from a local roaster who sources directly from farmers in Guatemala. I pay my rent on time, I water my collection of succulents that somehow thrive in the Pacific Northwest gloom, and according to my family, I'm the cautionary tale they tell at dinner parties. My loft is my sanctuary. Exposed brick walls lined with whiteboards covered in flowcharts and user journey maps. A standing desk where I code late into the night, fueled by determination and the kind of stubborn optimism that refuses to acknowledge defeat. The living room doubles as a meeting space where I've hosted everyone from city council members to food bank directors, all of us crowded around my grandmother's antique dining table, plotting ways to feed more people with less waste. I used to be the golden child. Valedictorian at Lincoln High School, where I gave the graduation speech about perseverance and following your dreams. Full scholarship to Stanford, pre-med track with a minor in business administration. My parents, both immigrants who arrived from Taiwan with nothing but medical degrees that weren't recognized in America, worked 16-hour days to build their accounting firm from a kitchen table operation into a thriving practice with 12 employees and offices in 2 cities. They saw me as their American dream realized in human form. The daughter who would achieve everything they'd sacrificed for. My younger brother Danny was always the creative one, the kid who drew elaborate comic strips in the margins of his math homework and talked about making movies that would change the world. He was tolerated, even indulged, because I was the serious one. I was the one who would become a surgeon, marry another professional, and give them grandchildren with advanced degrees and stable futures. But college broke something in me. Not the coursework. I could handle organic chemistry and calculus in my sleep. Not the pressure. I'd been managing expectations my entire life. What broke me was the slow, dawning realization that I was living someone else's blueprint with terrifying precision. Every pre-med class felt like wearing clothes that were the wrong size, technically functional but never quite right. Every biology lab felt like performance art, me playing the role of future doctor, while my actual self withered somewhere deep inside. The breaking point came during a volunteer shift at the Stanford Medical Center. I was shadowing a surgeon, something I'd done dozens of times before, when I watched him explain a diagnosis to a patient's family. The compassion was genuine, the expertise undeniable, but I felt nothing. No spark of recognition, no sense of, this is where I belong. Just the hollow echo of going through motions I'd memorized rather than chosen. That night I sat in my dorm room and tried to imagine my life in 10 years. The vision that came to me was technically successful and completely empty. A pristine career built on someone else's passion. A life that looked perfect from the outside while feeling like a prison from within. I was excelling at something that made me feel hollow, and the worst part was that no one noticed. They just kept cheering for the grades while I disappeared a little more each semester. My parents called every Sunday to ask about my classes, my professors, my MCE prep. They never asked how I felt, what I dreamed about, what made me excited to wake up in the morning. The conversation was always about metrics. GPA, test scores, rankings, acceptance rates. Junior year I discovered computer science almost by accident. I'd registered for an introductory programming class to fulfill a general education requirement, expecting it to be a mindless elective. Instead I found myself staying up until 3 a.m. working on assignments, not because I had to but because I wanted to. There was something magical about building something from nothing, about solving problems with elegant code, about creating tools that could actually help people. My first real program was embarrassingly simple. A web app that helped students find study groups based on their schedules and learning styles. But watching classmates use it, seeing their faces light up when they found their perfect study partners, gave me a rush that no A+ in biochemistry ever had. I was hooked. The announcement at Thanksgiving dinner was met with the kind of silence usually reserved for funeral homes. I'd rehearsed the conversation in my head for weeks, trying to find the right words to explain why I was switching from pre-med to computer science. I'd prepared statistics about the tech industry, salary projections, examples of successful Stanford CS graduates. What I hadn't prepared for was the complete breakdown in communication that followed. My father set down his chopsticks and stared at me like I'd announced I was joining a cult. "Programming is for people who can't handle real careers," he said, his voice flat with disappointment. "It's what you do when you can't get into medical school." My mother stared at her plate and asked if I was having a breakdown. "Is this about stress? We can get you a therapist. There are medications that can help with anxiety." Danny, 17 and still hopeful about family dynamics, said maybe I could make video games, which would be cool. Everyone laughed. Not with him, at him. At us. At the naive idea that following your passion was more important than following the predetermined path to respectability. My uncle, who'd been drinking wine throughout dinner, leaned back in his chair and shook his head. "Sarah, you're throwing away everything your parents worked for. Do you know how many people would kill for your opportunities?" The rest of the meal passed in tense silence, punctuated by my mother's occasional sighs and my father's pointed questions about whether I'd considered the financial implications of my decision. I tried to explain that computer science wasn't a backup plan, that it was actually what I wanted to do, but they'd already decided I was having some kind of crisis that would pass if they ignored it hard enough. The real breaking point came during my senior year. I'd been working on a project with two classmates, Raj and Maria, building an app that connected food banks with surplus inventory from restaurants and grocery stores. We called it Food Bridge. The idea was beautifully simple: reduce waste while feeding people who needed it. Most restaurants threw away perfectly good food at the end of each day, while food banks struggled to maintain consistent inventory. Our app would create a bridge between surplus and need. We spent months coding, testing, refining. Late nights in the computer lab, fueled by energy drinks and the kind of manic enthusiasm that comes from knowing you're building something that matters. We developed algorithms to predict restaurant surplus, created a user interface that food bank volunteers could navigate easily, built a system for coordinating pickups and deliveries. The technical challenges were fascinating. How do you account for the unpredictability of restaurant inventory? How do you optimize delivery routes when you're dealing with perishable goods and volunteer drivers? How do you scale a system that depends on human coordination across multiple organizations? We even won a campus innovation contest, beating out teams with slicker presentations and more traditional business models. The judges were impressed by our prototype, our impact projections, our detailed implementation plan. For the first time in my academic career, I felt like I was being recognized for work that actually mattered to me. But when I showed my parents the prototype, they looked at it like I'd brought home a participation trophy. I'd prepared a full presentation: market analysis, user testimonials, financial projections. I'd even included a demo video showing how the app worked in real time. "This is nice," my mother said, the word nice delivered like a diagnosis of terminal mediocrity. "But when are you going to focus on something serious? Something that will actually support you?" My father scrolled through the app for about 30 seconds before handing my laptop back. "It's a charity project," he said dismissively. "You can't build a career on giving things away for free." I tried to explain that social entrepreneurship was a legitimate field, that there were successful companies built around solving social problems, that impact and profit weren't mutually exclusive. They nodded politely, the way you nod at a child explaining their imaginary friend. "Sarah," my mother said gently, "it's wonderful that you want to help people. But you need to think practically. What happens when you want to buy a house? Start a family? You can't support children on good intentions." That conversation haunted me for months. Not because they were wrong about the challenges of nonprofit work, but because they couldn't see past the challenges to the possibilities. They'd raced me to believe that success meant stability, that stability meant following conventional paths, that conventional paths were the only ones worth taking. I graduated with honors, but the celebration felt like a funeral. My parents hosted a party at their house, inviting family friends and business associates who'd watched me grow up. Everyone kept asking about my plans, their voices bright with expectation. Medical school? Law school? When I mentioned that my team was being incubated by a local tech accelerator, that we'd received seed funding to develop FoodBridge into a real company, my uncle actually patted my shoulder and said, "Well, everyone needs a hobby." Mrs. Kim, my mother's longest-standing friend, pulled me aside during the party. "Your parents are so worried about you," she whispered conspiratorially. "They think you're going through some kind of quarter-life crisis. Have you considered therapy?" The assumption that my career choice was a mental health issue rather than a deliberate decision was both infuriating and heartbreaking. I'd never been more certain about anything in my life, and the people who supposedly knew me best were treating my certainty like a symptom of confusion. That summer, while my parents hosted dinner parties where they strategically didn't mention what I was doing, Foodbridge launched in Portland. We started small, 5 restaurants and 3 food banks, all connected through our app. The first week was terrifying. Would the restaurants actually report their surplus? Would the food banks trust food from unknown sources? Would our volunteer drivers show up reliably? But it worked. Within 2 months, we'd rescued over 10,000 pounds of food. The restaurants loved reducing their waste disposal costs. The food banks loved having access to fresh produce and prepared meals. The volunteers loved being part of something that made a tangible difference in their community. I'll never forget the first time I visited Powell Boulevard Food Bank and saw meals being distributed that had been rescued through our app. Families lined up in the rain, grateful for fresh vegetables and day-old pastries that would have otherwise ended up in dumpsters. Children eating apples that had been deemed too imperfect for grocery store shelves. Elderly people carefully selecting bread and produce, making them last through the week. Maria, our food bank coordinator, introduced me to Mrs. Rodriguez, a volunteer who'd been helping with food distribution for over a decade. "This app has changed everything," she told me in accented English. "Before, we never knew what we would have each day. Now we can plan. We can tell people what to expect. We can serve more families." By the end of our first year, we had 47 partner businesses across Portland and were operating in 3 cities. We'd rescued over 200,000 pounds of food and served more than 80,000 meals. The local newspaper wrote a feature story about us. The mayor invited us to a press conference about food security initiatives. But at family gatherings, I was still the one who didn't have a real job. Danny had gotten into film school at USC, and suddenly he was the promising one, the son with a clear path forward. My parents would introduce him as "our son the filmmaker," and me as Sarah, who's doing some computer stuff. The thing about being dismissed is that it gives you a strange kind of freedom. When people stop watching, you stop performing. You start building for real without the pressure of constant evaluation. While my family gossiped about my phase, I was hiring developers, negotiating partnerships with major grocery chains, and learning that impact scales differently than expectations. The work was harder than I'd anticipated. Building a nonprofit requires all the business skills of a for-profit company, plus the additional challenge of mission alignment, donor relations, and stakeholder management across multiple sectors. I learned to write grant proposals, manage volunteer teams, navigate city regulations, and speak the language of social impact measurement. There were weeks when I worked 80-hour days, wearing every hat from CEO to customer service representative. I learned to code mobile apps, design user interfaces, analyze data, write marketing copy, and present to boards of directors. I negotiated with restaurant chains, collaborated with city officials, and testified at public hearings about food waste policy. By year 3, Foodbridge had diverted over 2 million pounds of food from landfills. We'd expanded to 12 cities across Oregon and Washington, with a team of 37 full-time employees and hundreds of volunteers. We were profiled in Fast Company, invited to present at food security conferences, and cited in academic research about technology solutions to hunger. But at my cousin's wedding, when someone asked what I did, my mother still answered for me, "Sarah's trying to figure things out." I stopped correcting her. What was the point? They'd built a story about me that didn't include success unless it looked exactly like theirs. So I let them keep their story while I built something they couldn't see. The irony was sharp enough to cut. I was solving problems they claimed to care about. My parents donated to food banks every holiday season, wrote checks to homeless shelters, volunteered at church fundraisers, and talked constantly about the importance of community service. But when I created a system that actually moved the needle on hunger, they couldn't see it as real work because it didn't come with a white coat or a corner office. The disconnect was particularly painful during family dinners, where conversation often turned to social issues. My father would complain about government waste, my mother would worry about homelessness downtown, My uncle would pontificate about the need for innovation in addressing community problems. I would sit there quietly eating my food, listening to them discuss solutions I was actually implementing. Once, during a particularly animated conversation about food insecurity, my aunt suggested that someone should create an app to help coordinate food donations. I mentioned that such an app already existed, that I'd actually built it. She looked at me blankly for a moment, then continued talking as if I hadn't spoken. FoodBridge grew quietly, steadily, while I learned to carry the weight of being invisible to the people who raised me. It's a particular kind of loneliness, being successful in ways your family can't recognize. You want to share your victories, but you've learned that your victories don't translate to their language of achievement. The app evolved beyond simple food rescue into a comprehensive platform for food system optimization. We developed predictive algorithms that could forecast restaurant surplus with 83% accuracy, helping food banks plan their distribution schedules more effectively. We created volunteer management tools that coordinated thousands of people across multiple cities, tracking hours, skills, and availability. We partnered with major grocery chains to rescue produce that was approaching its sell-by date. We worked with catering companies to redirect surplus from corporate events. We collaborated with universities to capture excess food from dining halls. Each partnership required months of negotiation, custom software development, and careful relationship management. The complexity of the operation would have impressed my business-minded family, if they'd ever asked about it. We managed supply chains, optimized logistics, analyzed market trends, and developed strategic partnerships. We created detailed financial models, measured social impact, and reported to multiple stakeholders. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated business operation they respected, wrapped in a mission they couldn't see as legitimate. Meanwhile, recognition came from unexpected places. We were featured in a TED Talk about technology for social good. We won grants from the Gates Foundation and the Ford Foundation. The USDA invited us to Washington to discuss federal food waste policy. International nonprofits reached out to learn about our model. But none of that mattered at Sunday dinner, where the conversation still centered on when I was going to get serious about my career. My mother would ask with genuine concern whether I was saving enough for retirement. My father would suggest that I consider going back to school for an MBA. They treated my work like an extended volunteer project, something admirable but not sustainable. The weight of being invisible to the people who raised you is particular. It's not anger exactly, more like a constant low-grade fever. You learn to carry it without complaining because what would you say? Please see me? Please ask me questions? Please stop treating my life's work like a hobby? The words feel too small for the emptiness they're trying to fill. I developed coping mechanisms. I surrounded myself with people who understood my work, who could engage with the technical challenges and celebrate the victories. I built a professional network of social entrepreneurs, nonprofit leaders, and technology innovators who spoke my language. I found mentors who had built similar organizations, who could offer guidance and encouragement. But there was always this hollow space where my family's recognition should have been. I wanted to call my mother when we reached our millionth meal served. I wanted to share the excitement of our first major foundation grant with my father. I wanted them to understand that I wasn't just playing with computers, that I was building something that mattered. Danny graduated from film school and moved back to Portland to work on a documentary about local businesses. He was 25 then, full of ideas and optimism, the kind of person who still believed family dinner could be a place where dreams were supported instead of evaluated. He'd always been the family mediator, the one who tried to bridge the gap between our parents' expectations and our own ambitions. He asked me to meet him for coffee one Tuesday afternoon at a cafe we'd been going to since we were kids. I expected another update about his film projects, maybe a request to borrow money for equipment. What I didn't expect was for him to slide a laptop across the table and say, "I think I've been an idiot." On the screen was a research document he'd compiled about FoodBridge. Press coverage, impact statistics, financial reports he'd somehow accessed through public records and nonprofit databases. He'd spent weeks mapping out what I'd built, not because he was assigned to, but because he'd finally started asking questions no one else in our family had bothered to ask. The document was thorough, professional, the kind of analysis I might have commissioned for a board presentation. He'd tracked our growth across multiple metrics, compared our impact to other food rescue organizations, and documented our media coverage and awards. He'd even included testimonials from partner organizations and volunteers. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was different. "Serious. Do you know what you've actually done?" I looked at his notes, seeing my work reflected back through someone else's eyes for the first time in years. The numbers were impressive even to me. 15 cities. 127 partner businesses. 4.2 million pounds of food rescued. 1.7 million meals provided. A team of 53 full-time employees and hundreds of volunteers. Revenue of $2.3 million annually, with 94% going directly to program costs. "I've been making a documentary about Portland's food scene," he continued, "and your name keeps coming up. Every food bank director knows you. Every restaurant owner has heard of Foodbridge. Some of them didn't even know you were my sister until I mentioned it." He paused, laptop still open between us, rain beginning to spatter against the cafe windows. "Mom and Dad have no idea what you've built, do they?" I shook my head, suddenly feeling exposed in a way I hadn't expected. How could they know? They'd never asked the right questions, never shown curiosity about the details of my work, never engaged with the substance of what I was building. "There's something else," Danny said, his voice gentler now. "I've been dating someone. She's a social worker, specializes in food insecurity policy. She's heard you speak at conferences. She said you're kind of a legend in the nonprofit tech space." The word legend felt foreign coming from my little brother's mouth. I'd been so focused on proving myself to people who weren't looking that I'd forgotten there was a whole world of people who were. "She doesn't know you're my sister," he continued. "I was going to tell her, but I wanted to talk to you first. She's coming to Mom's birthday dinner next month. She's nervous about meeting the family." I almost laughed. Jessica, who apparently knew my professional reputation, was nervous about meeting my family. Meanwhile, my family would probably ask her what she did for a living while completely ignoring the fact that she already knew their daughter's work better than they did. "What are you going to do?" I asked. Danny closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "I'm going to tell her the truth. That I have a sister who's changing the world and I've been too stupid to see it." The conversation that followed was different from any we'd had as adults. Danny asked detailed questions about Foodbridge, about the challenges of scaling a nonprofit, about the technical aspects of food distribution logistics. He wanted to understand not just what I did but how I did it, why I'd made certain decisions, what obstacles I'd overcome. For the first time in years, I felt seen by a member of my family. Not evaluated, not dismissed, not tolerated, but actually seen. Danny listened like my work mattered, asked follow-up questions like my answers were important, and responded with the kind of enthusiasm I'd learned to find elsewhere. "I want to help," he said finally. "I don't know how, but I want to be part of this somehow. Maybe I could make a short film about Foodbridge? Document the impact, tell the story." The offer was generous, but what meant more was the recognition behind it. Danny had finally seen me clearly and he wanted to help other people see me too. Mom's 65th birthday fell on a rainy Saturday in October. The whole extended family gathered at my parents' house in Lake Oswego, the same dining room where I'd announced my major change, the same table where I'd been gently mocked for years. I arrived early to help set up, mostly because I wanted to control my own narrative for once. The house looked exactly the same as it had throughout my childhood. Family photos lined the hallway, chronicling graduations, weddings, and achievements. My high school valedictorian photo was prominently displayed, along with my Stanford acceptance letter. But there were no photos from my adult life, no recognition of anything I'd accomplished since college. Danny introduced Jessica during cocktail hour, and I watched the family's practiced routine of polite interrogation. She was smaller than I'd expected, with thoughtful eyes and the kind of smile that reached her whole face. She answered questions about her work with intelligence and warmth, clearly comfortable talking about social policy and community development. When she got to me, she paused. "Sarah, right? Danny's sister?" I nodded. "That's me. He mentioned you work in tech. What kind of technology?" Before I could answer, my mother appeared with a tray of appetizers, her hostess radar finely tuned to conversations that might need redirecting. "Sarah does computer programming," she said with the tone people use when they're being polite about something they don't understand. "Danny, why don't you show Jessica the photo albums?" Jessica looked between us, clearly sensing undercurrents she couldn't identify. "Maybe later," she said diplomatically. I'd love to hear more about Sarah's work first. My mother's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. I'm sure it's very complicated. Sarah, could you help me in the kitchen? I followed her, but I could hear Danny behind me quietly explaining to Jessica that our family didn't really talk about work stuff at parties. Jessica's response was too soft to hear, but I caught Danny's nervous laugh. The kitchen was full of the usual pre-dinner chaos. My aunt was arranging flowers, my cousin was setting up the bar, and my mother was orchestrating everything with the efficiency of someone who'd been hosting family gatherings for decades. Jessica seems nice, I said, trying to make conversation. She's lovely, my mother agreed, checking the oven. Very articulate. Danny seems quite taken with her. She works in food security policy, I offered. Social work. My mother said, not really listening. Could you take this platter to the dining room? Dinner was the usual performance. My father made toasts about family and tradition. My uncle told stories about the good old days. My cousins talked about their kids' achievements. Soccer trophies, honor roll, college acceptances. I sat between Danny and my aunt, cutting my salmon into small pieces and wondering why I kept showing up to these exercises in marginalization. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. Real estate prices, vacation plans, political opinions, neighborhood gossip. I contributed politely when directly addressed, but mostly I observed. This was my family, the people who'd raised me and shaped me, and I felt like a stranger among them. It was during dessert that everything shifted. My mother was distributing slices of birthday cake when Jessica, who'd been quiet for most of the meal, suddenly turned to me with a puzzled expression. I'm sorry, she said, but I have to ask. Sarah, is your last name Chin? I looked up from my plate, fork halfway to my mouth. Yes. And you live in Portland? Yes. Jessica's fork clattered against her plate. Oh my God. You're Sarah Chin. The Sarah Chin who founded Foodbridge. The room went quiet in the way that happens before earthquakes. My mother's hand paused halfway to setting down a plate. My father looked up from his coffee. Danny grinned with barely contained excitement. I'm sorry, Jessica continued, looking around the table with growing amazement. I can't believe this. Sarah, I use your platform every day. I manage food distribution for 3 shelters downtown. Foodbridge has completely transformed how we operate. She turned to my parents, her voice gaining strength. You must be so proud. Your daughter has revolutionized food rescue in the Pacific Northwest. She's spoken at the National Hunger Forum twice. Her work has been featured in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. My mother's mouth opened and closed without sound. My father set down his coffee cup carefully, as if sudden movements might shatter whatever spell was being cast. I submitted a case study about Foodbridge to the Journal of Social Work last year. Jessica went on, her professional enthusiasm overriding any sense of family dinner decorum. The efficiency metrics are incredible. You've created a model that cities across the country are trying to replicate. I'm sorry, my aunt interjected, her voice sharp with confusion. What exactly does Sarah's company do? Jessica looked at her like she'd asked what oxygen was for. Foodbridge is a technology platform that connects food businesses with hunger relief organizations. They've rescued millions of pounds of food that would have otherwise gone to waste. It's one of the most successful food security initiatives on the West Coast. She turned back to me, her eyes bright with professional excitement. The predictive analytics alone. How did you develop the spoilage algorithms? The efficiency gains you've documented are unlike anything I've seen in the field. I found my voice, rusty from disuse in family settings. Machine learning models trained on historical data from partner restaurants. We can predict surplus inventory with about 83% accuracy now. Incredible, Jessica said, shaking her head. And the volunteer coordination system? That's proprietary software, isn't it? Built from scratch. We needed something that could handle real-time logistics across multiple locations while maintaining data security and user privacy. Jessica's professional admiration was palpable. I've been trying to get a meeting with your team for months. We want to implement your model in rural Oregon counties, but the scaling challenges are complex. The table was silent except for the sound of rain against the windows and the gentle ticking of my grandmother's clock. My mother was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Danny was practically vibrating with vindication. Sarah, my father said slowly, carefully, How long have you been doing this? 6 years. And it's successful? Jessica laughed, a sound of genuine disbelief. Successful? It's groundbreaking. Sarah's work has been cited in congressional testimony about food waste. The USDA has used FoodBridge data to inform federal policy recommendations. My uncle cleared his throat. So this is profitable? It's a non-profit, I explained, but we're financially sustainable. We've received grants from major foundations and have service contracts with city governments across the region. Jessica pulled out her phone. I'm sorry, I have to show you something. She scrolled through her photos and found what she was looking for. This is from last month's Regional Food Security Conference. Sarah was the keynote speaker. She passed the phone around the table. In the photo, I was standing on a stage in front of a packed auditorium mid-speech, gesturing toward a slide showing FoodBridge's impact metrics. I looked confident, authoritative, completely in my element. I barely recognized myself. 300 people came to hear her speak, Jessica continued, oblivious to the shockwaves she was creating. People drove from 5 states away. Sarah's approach to data-driven food rescue is being studied by nonprofits internationally. My mother was looking at the photo when she spoke, her voice small. We had no idea. How could you not know? Jessica asked, genuinely confused. Sarah's work has been covered in the Oregonian, the Seattle Times, Portland Business Journal. She was featured on Oregon Public Broadcasting last year. Danny leaned forward, his moment of vindication finally arriving. Mom, Dad, I tried to tell you. I've been trying to tell you for months. You said she was successful, my father said defensively. You didn't say she was famous. I'm not famous, I said quietly. I just do good work. Jessica turned to me with something approaching reverence. Sarah, you're being modest. You've built something extraordinary. The ripple effects of FoodBridge extend far beyond food rescue. You've created jobs, reduced environmental impact, strengthened community networks. You're not just running a nonprofit. You're running a social enterprise that's changing how cities think about waste and hunger. She looked around the table again, her confusion now mixed with something like indignation. I assumed you all knew. This is Sarah Chin. She's kind of a big deal in our world. The silence that followed was different from the silences I was used to. This wasn't dismissal or polite disinterest. This was shock. The kind that comes when you realize you've been living next to a mountain and calling it a molehill. My mother was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah, why didn't you tell us? I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in years. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of missed connections and failed communication. When was I supposed to tell you? I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion building behind it. When you introduced me as figuring things out. When you asked if I was having a breakdown for switching majors. When you called my work a hobby. But this is different, she said, gesturing toward Jessica's phone, which still displayed the conference photo. How? It's important. It was always important. You just couldn't see it. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. People asked questions I'd been wanting to answer for years. Jessica showed them articles I'd written, impact reports I'd published, photos from events I'd spoken at. My parents sat quietly, absorbing the reality that their daughter had been building something significant while they were busy being disappointed in her. When it was time to leave, Jessica hugged me goodbye. I hope this wasn't too overwhelming, she said. I just couldn't believe it. Danny talks about his brilliant sister all the time, but he never mentioned you were the FoodBridge Sarah Chen. I looked at Danny surprised. You've been talking about me? He shrugged, but his smile was warm. Someone had to. That night, I sat in my loft watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked windows. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from family members who suddenly wanted to know more about my work. My mother had sent a link to an article about FoodBridge with the message, I saved this to show my friends. Jessica turned to me with something approaching reverence. Sarah, you're being modest. You've built something extraordinary. The ripple effects of FoodBridge extend far beyond food rescue. You've created jobs, reduced environmental impact, strengthened community networks. You're not just running a nonprofit. You're running a social enterprise that's changing how cities think about waste and hunger. She looked around the table again, her confusion now mixed with something like indignation. I assumed you all knew. This is Sarah Chin. She's kind of a big deal in our world. The silence that followed was different from the silences I was used to. This wasn't dismissal or polite disinterest. This was shock. The kind that comes when you realize you've been living next to a mountain and calling it a molehill. My mother was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah, why didn't you tell us?" I really looked at her for the first time in years. The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of missed connections and failed communication. "When was I supposed to tell you?" I asked, my voice steady despite the emotion building behind it. "When you introduced me as figuring things out. When you asked if I was having a breakdown for switching majors. When you called my work a hobby." "But this is different," she said, gesturing toward Jessica's phone, which still displayed the conference photo. "How?" "It's important. It was always important. You just couldn't see it." The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. People asked questions I'd been wanting to answer for years. Jessica showed them articles I'd written, impact reports I'd published, photos from events I'd spoken at. My parents sat quietly, absorbing the reality that their daughter had been building something significant while they were busy being disappointed in her. When it was time to leave, Jessica hugged me goodbye. "I hope this wasn't too overwhelming," she said. "I just couldn't believe it. Danny talks about his brilliant sister all the time, but he never mentioned you were the food bridge Sarah Chen." I looked at Danny surprised. "You've been talking about me?" He shrugged, but his smile was warm. "Someone had to." That night, I sat in my loft watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked windows. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from family members who suddenly wanted to know more about my work. My mother had sent a link to an article about Foodbridge with the message, "I saved this to show my friends." I didn't reply right away. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. Tired of being surprised that they were surprised. Tired of having to be validated by a stranger before my own family could see me clearly. Tired of the emotional labor of managing their expectations while building something meaningful. But there was also something else. Relief maybe. The secret was out. The careful compartmentalization I'd maintained for years had finally collapsed, and the result wasn't catastrophic. It was just different. The next morning, Danny called before I'd even finished my coffee. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "A big one. We all do." "You don't owe me anything," I told him, settling into my desk chair. "You brought Jessica to dinner. You asked questions. That's more than anyone else did. But I should have asked years ago. I should have looked. I should have made them look. That's not your job." "Maybe not, but it's what brothers do. Or should do. I've been so focused on my own stuff that I never really paid attention to yours." A week later my mother called. Not to chat, not to ask about my weekend, but to say she'd been reading about Foodbridge online. She'd found my TED Talk, watched it twice and sent it to her book club. She wanted to know if I'd be willing to come speak to their group about social entrepreneurship. "I'd like to understand what you've built," she said, her voice careful. "Really understand it." I said yes, not because I needed her approval anymore, but because I'd spent so long being invisible that I'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen. The book club meeting was held in Mrs. Patterson's living room, the same Mrs. Patterson who'd watched me grow up, who'd asked every year when I was going to get married and have children. 15 women in their 60s and 70s, sitting in a circle with notebooks and reading glasses, listening to me explain food waste statistics and supply chain optimization like it was the most fascinating thing they'd ever heard. When I finished my presentation, they asked questions. Real questions. About funding models and scalability challenges and impact measurement. Mrs. Patterson wanted to know if there were volunteer opportunities. Another woman asked about expanding to senior center meal programs. They treated me like an expert, which I was, but no one in my family had ever seemed to realize. "Sarah," Mrs. Patterson said after the formal Q&A had ended, "I owe you an apology. We've all been asking the wrong questions for years, haven't we?" I smiled, feeling something shift in my chest. "You weren't asking the wrong questions. You were just asking the questions you knew how to ask. But we should have known how to ask better ones." That afternoon my mother drove me home. We sat in her car outside my building for 20 minutes, engine running, neither of us moving to get out. "I'm proud of you," she said finally. "I should have said that years ago." "I know you are. You just didn't know what to be proud of." "That's not an excuse." "It's not about excuses, Mom. It's about understanding. She turned to look at me, really look at me the way she used to when I was small and had scraped my knee or gotten my feelings hurt at school. How do we fix this? I thought about it, watching people hurry past on the sidewalk, umbrellas bobbing in the perpetual Portland drizzle. We start over. We ask different questions. We listen to different answers. Can you teach me? Yeah, I said. I can teach you. 6 months later, my mother volunteered to help coordinate Foodbridge's first annual fundraising gala. She threw herself into the project with the same intensity she'd once reserved for trying to redirect my career path. She learned the names of our major donors, memorized our impact statistics, and gave speeches about food security that were both passionate and precisely researched. Danny's documentary about Foodbridge premiered at the Portland International Film Festival. It wasn't just about the app or the impact statistics. It was about invisibility and recognition, about building something meaningful in the shadows, about families learning to see each other clearly. When the lights came up after the screening, my parents were crying. My father started introducing me differently at parties. This is my daughter Sarah, he'd say. She runs Foodbridge. You've probably heard of it. He'd learned enough about my work to answer basic questions, and when conversations got technical, he'd turn to me with genuine interest and say, Sarah, can you explain how the algorithm works? The change wasn't instant or perfect. Old patterns of communication don't disappear overnight. But we were all trying, all learning to see each other more clearly. They asked about my work. I told them about my work. Simple as that, and somehow revolutionary. 3 years after Jessica's revelation at my mother's birthday dinner, Foodbridge was operating in 43 cities across 7 states. We'd rescued over 15 million pounds of food and served more than 6 million meals. I'd spoken at conferences on 4 continents and had been featured on the cover of Social Enterprise Quarterly. But the recognition that mattered most came on a Tuesday evening in December, when my parents drove downtown to my loft for dinner. They'd never visited before, had never asked to see where I lived and worked. My mother walked slowly around the space, studying the whiteboards covered in flowcharts, the wall of awards and press clippings, the framed photo of me accepting our first major foundation grant. This is where it all happens, she said, not a question but a statement of wonder. This is home, I replied. We ordered takeout from a Vietnamese restaurant and sat around my grandmother's antique table, the same table where I'd hosted city council members and food bank directors, plotting ways to feed more people with less waste. My parents asked about upcoming partnerships, about scaling challenges, about my team's recent hire. Normal work conversation, the kind I'd been longing for from them for years. After they left, I stood at my industrial windows watching their taillights disappear into the rain-slicked streets. The city spread out below me, millions of lights in the darkness, each one representing someone living their own complicated story of recognition and invisibility, of building something meaningful and hoping to be seen. I'd learned that success doesn't always look like what your family expects. Sometimes it looks like algorithms that predict restaurant surplus with 87% accuracy. We'd improved since Jessica's dinner. Sometimes it looks like volunteer coordination systems that manage thousands of people across multiple cities. Sometimes it looks like 6 million meals served to people who might otherwise go hungry. But more than that, I'd learned that being seen isn't just about recognition. It's about understanding. It's about people taking the time to ask the right questions and listen to the answers. It's about families learning to speak each other's languages of achievement. My phone buzzed with a text from Danny. Jessica and I got engaged. Want to help plan the wedding? We're thinking about having a sustainable catering model. Know anyone who could help with that? I smiled and typed back, I might know someone. Outside my windows, Portland glittered in the rain. Somewhere in the city, restaurants were closing for the night, calculating their surplus inventory. Food bank coordinators were planning tomorrow's distribution schedules. Volunteers were checking the app to see where they were needed. The system I'd built was working quietly and efficiently, moving food from surplus to need, transforming waste into nourishment. And for the first time in years, I wasn't building it alone in the shadows. My family could finally see what I'd been doing all along. They could see me. The invisible success had finally become visible, not because it had changed, but because the people looking at it had learned how to see. That's the thing about being dismissed by the people who raised you. It teaches you to build something so undeniably meaningful that eventually even they can't ignore it. But the real victory isn't in their recognition. It's in learning that you don't need it to keep building. You build because the work matters. Because the problems are real. Because somewhere in your city, there are people who need what you're creating. And if your family learns to see you clearly along the way, that's not the goal. It's just a beautiful bonus. My name is Sarah Chin. I'm 32 years old now. I live in a converted loft in downtown Portland, Oregon, where I can hear the rain on the metal roof and see the city lights blur through industrial windows. I make pour-over coffee every morning using beans from a local roaster who sources directly from farmers in Guatemala. I pay my rent on time. I water my collection of succulents that somehow thrive in the Pacific Northwest gloom. And according to my family, I'm exactly who I was always meant to be. They just had to learn how to see it.